The fog clung to the Northern California coastline like a shroud, thick and unforgiving, muffling the sound of Marcus's sedan as it wound through the pine-lined road. Octavia Sterling sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, still wearing David's oversized wool slippers, the ones she'd grabbed in her haste to leave the house 3 days after what she'd been told was his funeral. The silence between mother and son was suffocating, heavier than the mist pressing against the windows. "This is where you get out," Marcus said, his voice flat, mechanical. Octavia blinked, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" Her son, her only child, the boy she'd raised with scraped knees and bedtime stories, the man she'd trusted when he'd gently explained that David's condition required specialized care, wouldn't look at her. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, and his jaw was set in a way that reminded her painfully of his father. But David's determination had been born of love. This felt like something else entirely. "Raven's Rest is mine now," Marcus continued, reaching into the back seat to retrieve her purse. "Victoria's already changing the locks." The name hit her like a slap. Victoria, her daughter-in-law, with the perfect smile and the way of making every conversation feel like a performance. Octavia remembered the hushed conversations about David's declining mental state, Victoria's gentle but firm suggestions that a nursing facility would be safer for everyone. She trusted them, believed them when they'd said the stress of caring for David at home was too much for her to handle alone. "Marcus? This is insane," Octavia said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "I'm your mother. You'll figure it out. Mom, you always do." He leaned across her to open the passenger door, and she caught the scent of his cologne expensive, nothing like the Old Spice David used to wear. "There's nothing left for you at Raven's Rest." The cold bit at her ankles as David's slippers hit the gravel. The car door slammed with a finality that echoed through the fog, and Marcus was gone, his taillights disappearing like dying embers. Octavia stood there, purse clutched to her chest, listening to the ocean's distant whisper and trying to make sense of what had just happened. 3 weeks ago. She'd been caring for David at home, managing his medication, reading to him during his lucid moments. Then Victoria had arrived with pamphlets for Sunset Manor, a specialized facility 2 hours away. The doctors, Victoria explained, had recommended the move after David's latest episode, an incident Octavia didn't remember, couldn't recall David having any episodes at all. But she'd been so tired, so overwhelmed by the insurance calls and medication schedules. When Marcus had offered to handle the arrangements, she'd been grateful. The funeral, a closed casket affair that Victoria had insisted was more dignified, had been a blur of lilies and sympathetic murmurs from neighbors who seemed to know more about David's final days than she did. Now, standing in the fog with nothing but David's slippers and a growing sense of wrongness, Octavia felt the first stirrings of something that wasn't grief. It was suspicion. She'd walked half a mile when the memory hit her David's last coherent day at home, when he'd pressed something into her palm with shaking fingers while Victoria was in the kitchen. "Keep this safe, Octavia," he'd whispered, his voice barely audible. "Not what they think. Find Harrison." She'd assumed it was confusion, the medications making him paranoid. Now, fumbling in her wallet, she found the small silver key he'd given her. This wasn't the brass key to their safe deposit box. This was different, newer, with an address etched in tiny numbers: Harrison and Associates, David's personal attorney. The one Marcus didn't know about. The fog began to thin as she crested a hill, and the familiar neon sign of Betty's General Store flickered in the distance. Betty Wong had been running the place since before Octavia moved to the coast, had watched her build Raven's Rest from a rundown cottage into a thriving inn. If anyone would help her now, it would be Betty. The bell above the door chimed as Octavia stepped inside, her soaked slippers squelching on the worn linoleum. Betty looked up from behind the counter, her weathered face creasing with concern. "Octavia, what on earth? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I might have," Octavia said, sinking into the plastic chair Betty kept by the coffee machine. "Betty, I need to ask you something. David's funeral, did you see the body?" Betty's expression grew puzzled. "Honey, it was a closed casket. Victoria said it was what David wanted, more peaceful that way." "But did anyone actually see him before the funeral?" "Well, no. The funeral home handled everything. Victoria said you were too distraught to make decisions, that Marcus was taking care of the arrangements." Betty paused, studying Octavia's face. "Why are you asking?" Octavia pulled out the mysterious key, turning it over in her palm. "Because I'm starting to think David isn't dead." The law office of Harrison and Associates sat tucked between a used bookstore and a coffee shop. Its modest exterior hiding what Octavia would soon discover was a carefully orchestrated contingency plan. Attorney James Harrison was a thin man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades handling delicate family matters. "Mrs. Ravens," he said, rising from behind his desk as Betty showed her in. "I've been expecting you, though I prayed it wouldn't come to this." Octavia's hand trembled as she placed the key on his desk. "Mr. Harrison, I think my husband might still be alive." Harrison's face went pale. He moved quickly to the filing cabinet in the corner, using the key to unlock a small strongbox. From it, he withdrew a thick folder and a sealed envelope marked "Emergency Only." "Your husband came to see me 6 months ago," Harrison explained, his voice grim. He was deeply concerned about Victoria's influence over Marcus, and he'd begun to suspect that she was planning something drastic. He wanted to ensure you'd be protected if the worst happened. The folder contained documents Octavia recognized copies of their property deed, insurance policies, bank statements, but also things that made her blood run cold. Transfer forms with her forged signature, power of attorney documents she'd never signed, and most damning of all, commitment papers for Sunset Manor, authorizing David's involuntary placement due to severe dementia and risk of self-harm. "These are all forgeries," Octavia breathed, her finger tracing her supposedly own signature. "Your husband suspected as much. That's why he prepared this." Harrison opened the sealed envelope and withdrew a letter in David's careful handwriting, along with a small recording device. The letter was brief, but devastating. "Octavia, if you're reading this, then Victoria has convinced Marcus to have me committed. I am not suffering from dementia. I have been pretending to be confused to gather evidence of Victoria's plans. The recording device contains proof of everything. Get me out of Sunset Manor before she decides I'm too dangerous to keep alive. I love you. David," with shaking hands. Harrison activated the recording device. David's voice filled the room, clear and lucid, recounting weeks of conversations he'd overheard between Victoria and Marcus. "She's been researching nursing homes for months," David's recorded voice explained. "She found one 2 hours away where the staff can be bribed to over-medicate patients. She told Marcus I was becoming violent, that I didn't recognize you anymore. She's convinced him that committing me is an act of mercy." The recording continued, David's voice growing weaker but more urgent. "She's been slipping sedatives into my evening medication for weeks, making me groggy during the day so Marcus would see the symptoms she described. She plans to increase the dosage once I'm committed, until I'm completely docile. And once you're out of the way, Octavia, she'll arrange for an accident to make sure I never recover." Octavia felt the room spinning around her. "He's alive. David is alive. And I left him there. I believed them when they said he was dead." "The funeral was elaborate theater," Harrison confirmed. "Victoria hired actors to play funeral home staff. The casket was empty except for bags of sand to simulate weight. She needed Marcus to believe his father was truly gone, so he wouldn't have any reason to visit the nursing home. "How long do we have?" Octavia asked, her mind already racing ahead to rescue plans. Harrison's expression was grave. "According to David's last message, he's been calling my office using a smuggled phone whenever he can. Victoria is planning to visit him next week to increase his medication for his own comfort. I believe she intends to kill him then and claim his heart finally gave out." Octavia stood, her grief transforming into fierce determination. "Then we get him out before she has the chance." The drive to Moonrise Cottage gave Octavia time to process the enormity of what she'd learned. David wasn't dead. Her husband, her partner of 35 years, was trapped in a nursing home, probably confused and frightened, wondering why she'd abandoned him to Victoria's mercy. The cottage was everything the realtor had promised: rundown, isolated, and available immediately. But it wasn't meant to be a refuge anymore. It was a safe house, a place to bring David once they freed him from Sunset Manor. As she signed the lease with cash from the emergency account Harrison had helped her access, Octavia began formulating a plan. She couldn't simply walk into the nursing home and demand David's release. Victoria had legal guardianship papers. Forged, but convincing. She needed evidence of the fraud. Proof that David was being held against his will. That evening, she called Sarah Mitchell, the investigative journalist Betty had recommended. Sarah arrived within an hour, her eyes bright with the hunger of someone who'd been tracking a story for months. "I've been investigating Sunset Manor for 2 years, Sarah explained as they sat in the cottage's dingy kitchen. There have been 12 unexplained deaths in the past 18 months, all wealthy patients whose families had recently gained power of attorney. The state board keeps promising investigations, but somehow the paperwork always gets lost." "Can you get us inside?" Octavia asked. Sarah smiled grimly. "I've been working on that. I have a contact who works there, a nurse named Grace Chen who's been documenting suspicious activities. She's been waiting for someone with standing to blow the whistle." Grace Chen turned out to be a slight woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. She met them at a diner halfway between the cottage and Sunset Manor, speaking in low tones about what she'd witnessed. "Your husband is in the secure wing," Grace explained. "They keep him heavily sedated, but I've seen him during shift changes when his medication wears off. He's lucid, Mrs. Ravens. He knows where he is, and he's been trying to communicate with staff about being held against his will." "What kind of security does the facility have?" Sarah asked, taking notes. "Minimal during night shifts. The regular staff leaves at 8, and they only keep 2 nurses and a security guard overnight. But Mrs. Ravens, you need to understand if we're caught, your husband's life won't be worth much. Victoria Pierce has been very clear about what happens to people who interfere with her plans." Octavia thought of David, trapped and drugged, probably wondering why his wife hadn't come for him. "What do you need me to do?" The plan they developed over the next week was audacious in its simplicity. Grace would create a distraction during the night shift, a medical emergency, with another patient that would draw the nurses away from David's wing. Sarah would disable the security cameras using equipment borrowed from her media contact's son. And Octavia would walk into her husband's room and bring him home. But first, they needed to establish Moonrise Cottage as a proper safe house. Octavia threw herself into the work with desperate energy, scrubbing floors and mending the leaky roof as if the physical labor could somehow prepare her for what was coming. Amy Watson appeared on her doorstep 2 days before the planned rescue, a compact woman in scrubs with exhausted eyes and a suitcase held together with duct tape. "I heard you might have a room," Amy said. "I'm a nurse, and I'm going through a divorce. I can't afford hotels anymore, but I can help with medical care if you need it." Octavia looked at this stranger, this nurse, who might be exactly what David would need during his recovery, and made a split-second decision. "How do you feel about bending a few rules for a good cause?" Amy's smile was the first genuine one Octavia had seen in weeks. "Depends on the cause." When Octavia explained the situation, Amy didn't hesitate. I've worked in facilities like Sunset Manor. I've seen what happens to patients when families stop advocating for them. Count me in. The cottage gained another ally when Elena Vasquez arrived, ostensibly to deliver supplies that Sarah had ordered, but actually to serve as their legal observer. Elena was a social worker who specialized in elder abuse cases, and her presence would help legitimize their actions if they were caught. "What you're doing is legally complex," Elena explained as they went over the plan one final time. "Technically, Victoria has legal guardianship, which means taking David could be considered kidnapping. But if we can prove the guardianship was obtained through fraud, and if David is competent to make his own decisions, then we're actually facilitating a rescue." The night of the operation, Octavia found herself dressed in dark clothes, sitting in Sarah's car outside Sunset Manor at 2 a.m. The facility looked innocuous enough, a modern building with well-maintained grounds and tasteful signage. Only the barred windows on the upper floors hinted at its true nature. "Grace just texted," Sarah said, checking her phone. "The distraction is in place. You have maybe 20 minutes before the shift supervisor realizes what's happening." Octavia's hands were steady as she walked through the facility's main entrance, using the key card Grace had provided. The hallways were dimly lit and eerily quiet, broken only by the soft beeping of monitoring equipment and the occasional murmur from patient rooms. David's room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a corridor lined with doors that bore only numbers, no names. Octavia's heart hammered as she slipped inside, afraid of what she might find. Her husband lay in a narrow hospital bed, his once robust frame diminished by weeks of forced inactivity and chemical restraint. His hair had grown longer and grayer, and his face was pale and drawn. But when she whispered his name, his eyes opened immediately and focused on her with perfect clarity. "Octavia." His voice was hoarse from disuse, but unmistakably David's. "Is it really you? I'm here to take you home," she said, fighting back tears as she began disconnecting the IV lines that Amy had taught her to recognize. "Can you walk?" David struggled to sit up, his movements slow but determined. "I've been pretending to be weaker than I am," he said, "saving my strength for when you came. I knew you'd figure it out eventually." Getting David out of the facility required all the courage Octavia had spent 60 years accumulating. He leaned heavily on her as they made their way through corridors that seemed endless, past nursing stations where Grace's emergency was still commanding attention. Sarah met them at a side exit, helping to support David as they made their way to the car. They were 3 blocks away when David spoke again, his voice stronger now that they were clear of the building. "Victoria's planning to kill me next week," he said matter-of-factly. "She's been increasing my sedation gradually, testing how much my system can handle. She told Marcus it was to keep me comfortable, but I heard her on the phone with someone about timing and dosages." "She's not going to get the chance," Octavia said fiercely. "We have evidence now. You're alive, you're competent, and you can testify to everything that's happened." David reached for her hand, his fingers weak but warm. "I'm sorry you had to go through this alone. I heard about Marcus leaving you on that road. Victoria convinced him it was necessary, that you were becoming as unstable as she claimed I was." "Marcus was manipulated," Octavia said, though the words still tasted bitter. "We'll deal with him later. Right now, I just want to get you home." Back at Moonrise Cottage, Amy took charge of David's medical care with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years treating patients recovering from pharmaceutical abuse. His system was full of unnecessary sedatives and mood stabilizers, medications that would take weeks to clear completely. "The good news is that there's no permanent damage," Amy reported after her initial examination. "The bad news is that he's going to feel pretty awful for a while as his body adjusts to functioning without the drugs." David spent his first day of freedom sleeping in the cottage's master bedroom, his breathing deep and natural for the first time in months. Octavia sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, still hardly believing he was real and alive and home. When he woke that evening, his eyes were clearer than they'd been in the nursing home, though still heavy with exhaustion. "Tell me everything," he said, struggling to sit up. "What happened after they took me? How did you figure out I wasn't dead?" Octavia told him about the key, about Harrison, about the weeks of believing she was a widow. She told him about Marcus's betrayal, about Victoria's cruelty, about building a new life from the ashes of what they'd tried to destroy. "I'm proud of you," David said when she finished. "You didn't just survive, you fought back. You saved me, and you saved yourself." "We saved each other," Octavia corrected. "You left me the tools I needed. You recorded the evidence. You stayed strong enough to survive until I could find you." David's smile was the same one she'd fallen in love with 35 years ago. "So what's our next move?" "Now," Octavia said. "We make sure Victoria never hurts anyone again." With David safely recovering at Moonrise Cottage, the scope of their investigation expanded dramatically. No longer were they simply seeking justice for past crimes, they were building a case to prevent future ones. David's first-hand testimony about conditions at Sunset Manor, combined with Grace Chen's documentation and Sarah Mitchell's investigative research, painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond their personal situation. "Victoria isn't just a con artist," David explained during one of their strategy sessions around the cottage's kitchen table. "She's running what amounts to a murder factory. Sunset Manor exists to warehouse inconvenient relatives until they can be quietly eliminated." Amy, who had been researching the medications David had been given, looked up from her laptop with a grim expression. "The combination of drugs they were using on you would have caused organ failure within another month, slow enough to look natural, but absolutely fatal." Elena spread out charts she'd been creating, mapping connections between Victoria, Sunset Manor, and at least a dozen suspicious deaths over the past 2 years. She's been targeting families with significant assets, usually those dealing with recent health crises or family conflicts. She poses as a care coordinator or family friend, gains the trust of adult children, then gradually convinces them that their parent needs specialized care. Sarah had been working her network of contacts in law enforcement and had uncovered something even more disturbing. Victoria isn't working alone. She's part of a larger organization that specializes in what they call inheritance acceleration. They have people in nursing facilities, funeral homes, legal offices, even some hospitals. It's a completely integrated operation. The revelation that Victoria was part of a criminal network rather than a lone predator changed everything. They weren't just fighting for David and Octavia's family, they were potentially exposing a conspiracy that had killed dozens of people and stolen millions of dollars. "We need to move carefully," Elena warned. "If Victoria realizes we're onto the larger operation, she might decide to cut her losses and disappear, or worse, she might try to eliminate the witnesses." That's when Marcus called. Octavia almost didn't answer when she saw his name on her phone, but David encouraged her to take it. Their son's voice was strained, almost panicked. "Mom, something's wrong. Victoria's been acting strange, talking about taking a vacation, liquidating assets. She's been asking me questions about Dad's insurance policies, about whether there might be any legal challenges to his death certificate. I think she suspects something." Octavia looked around the table at her allies, David recovering but determined, Amy and Grace providing medical expertise, Elena and Sarah building the legal case that would bring Victoria down. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt ready to stop running and start fighting. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and I need you to decide right now whether you're going to help us or help her." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Octavia wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and broken. "Is Dad really alive?" "He's sitting right here next to me," Octavia said. Victoria had him committed to a nursing home under false pretenses. She's been slowly poisoning him for months while you believed he was dead." The sound Marcus made wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a scream. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought—" "She showed me medical reports, death certificates. She said you were having a breakdown, that you needed space to grieve. I thought I was protecting you." "You were manipulated," David said, speaking directly into the phone. "Son, Victoria is a professional. She's done this to other families. The important thing now is that you help us stop her. What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, they outlined a plan that would require Marcus to play a dangerous double game. He would continue acting as Victoria's ally while secretly gathering evidence and keeping them informed of her movements. It was risky if Victoria suspected his loyalty. She was certainly capable of violence, but his position as her supposed partner gave him access to information they needed. "She's planning something for this weekend," Marcus reported. "She's been talking about visiting the cemetery. I mean, to pay her respects. But she's also been researching burial laws and cremation procedures. I think she's planning to destroy evidence." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Victoria intended to have David's supposedly buried body exhumed and cremated, eliminating any possibility that forensic evidence could later prove he was still alive. It was a perfect way to cover her tracks, and it suggested she was preparing to flee. "We're out of time," Elena said. "We need to move now, before she can destroy the evidence or disappear." David, despite Amy's medical concerns about his condition, insisted on being part of the final confrontation. "Victoria needs to see that her plan failed completely," he said. "She needs to know that she didn't break us." The plan they developed was elegant in its directness. They would force a meeting with Victoria in a controlled environment, the cottage, where they had the advantage of familiar territory and multiple witnesses. Marcus would bring her there under the pretense of needing her help with some final details of David's estate. Once she was there, they would confront her with David's living presence and the evidence they'd gathered. "The goal is to get her confession on record," Sarah explained, testing the recording equipment they'd set up throughout the cottage's main room. "With David alive to contradict her claims and Marcus willing to testify about her manipulation, we should have enough to not only clear your names, but to bring down the entire network." Grace had volunteered to be nearby in case medical assistance was needed, either for David or for Victoria if the confrontation went badly. Elena would serve as their legal observer, ensuring that everything they did followed proper procedures. Amy would monitor David's condition throughout the encounter. The morning of the confrontation. Octavia woke before dawn to find David sitting on the cottage's front porch, watching the sun rise over the ocean. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the weeks of drugged captivity and the ongoing effects of pharmaceutical withdrawal, he looked more like himself than he had in months. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "I've been ready since the day they locked me up," he said. "I've had nothing but time to think about what I wanted to say to her, what I wanted her to know about what she stole from us." "What did she steal?" David considered this carefully. "Time," he said finally. "Weeks of our life together that we can never get back. Trust between you and Marcus that will take years to rebuild. Peace of mind that might never fully return." He paused, then smiled with something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't hatred either. "But she didn't steal us. We're still here. We're still together, in the end. That's what matters." At noon exactly. Marcus's car pulled into the cottage's driveway. Through the window, Octavia could see Victoria in the passenger seat, looking calm and composed as always. She had no idea that she was walking into the destruction of everything she'd worked for. "Showtime," Sarah murmured, activating the recording equipment. Octavia opened the door before they could knock, stepping aside to let them enter. Victoria walked in first, her eyes immediately scanning the room with the predatory awareness of someone who'd learned to assess threats quickly. "Octavia," she said, her voice carrying its usual note of condescending sympathy. "Marcus said you needed help with some final arrangements for David's estate. I hope you're not still having trouble accepting." She stopped mid-sentence as David stepped out of the bedroom, moving slowly but steadily, very much alive and very much present. The color drained from Victoria's face, as if someone had opened a valve. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, then shattered completely. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You're dead. I watched them bury you." "You watched them bury an empty casket," David said, his voice steady and clear. "While you had me drugged and imprisoned in Sunset Manor, slowly poisoning me while my wife grieved for a dead man." Victoria's eyes darted around the room, taking in the recording equipment, the assembled witnesses, the careful preparation that had gone into this moment. Her face cycled through shock, rage, and calculation before settling into something cold and dangerous. "You have no idea what you've interfered with," she said, her voice dropping to a hiss. "This is bigger than your little family drama. There are people involved who don't appreciate loose ends." "We know about the network," Elena said calmly. "We know about the other families, the other nursing homes, the whole operation. It's over. Victoria." For a moment, Victoria looked like she might try to run or fight. Then, perhaps recognizing that she was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, she sank into one of the cottage's wooden chairs. "You think you've won something," she said, her voice bitter. "You think this changes anything. There will always be people like me, and there will always be people like you trusting, naive, too attached to your precious families to see the truth about how the world really works." "Maybe," Octavia said, "but there will also always be people willing to fight back, people who choose love over greed, who build instead of steal, who protect instead of prey. And in the end, we're stronger than you are." Marcus, who had been standing frozen by the door, finally found his voice. "Victoria, all those times you said Dad was getting worse, that he didn't recognize us, you were lying about everything. I was protecting you from a painful truth," Victoria said. But the manipulation in her voice was transparent now, her techniques exposed and powerless. "Your father was dying anyway. I just made it easier for everyone." "Easier for you," Marcus corrected, his voice growing stronger. "You made it easier for you to steal from us, to destroy our family, to turn me into someone who would abandon his own mother." The confession that followed was everything they'd hoped for and more. Perhaps because she knew the game was up, or perhaps because 30 years of predatory behavior had left her incapable of genuine emotion. Victoria detailed her crimes with clinical precision. She described the network of corrupt officials and compromised facilities, the methods used to identify and isolate vulnerable targets, the systematic process of asset transfer and evidence destruction. Sarah's recording equipment captured every word, every damning admission, every detail that would help law enforcement dismantle the entire operation. By the time the police arrived, Elena had called them as soon as Victoria began confessing they had enough evidence to charge her with kidnapping, fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and attempted murder. The recording would also provide crucial intelligence for investigating the larger network and identifying other victims. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to look at Octavia and David one final time. "You think this is a happy ending," she said. "But you'll never feel safe again. You'll never trust anyone again. That's what I've really stolen from you, your ability to live without fear." David stepped forward, his arm around Octavia's waist, his voice calm but firm. "You're wrong," he said. "You've taught us that love is stronger than manipulation, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that families can survive anything if they choose to fight for each other. Thank you for the lesson. The courthouse steps were slick with morning dew as Octavia and David walked hand in hand toward the building where Victoria Pierce would face trial for kidnapping, elder abuse, and conspiracy. 6 months had passed since David's rescue from Sunset Manor, 6 months of his slow recovery and their careful preparation for this moment. "Are you ready for this?" Octavia asked, squeezing David's hand. He'd gained back most of the weight he'd lost during his captivity, but the experience had left him more fragile, more deliberate in his movements. "I've been ready since the day they locked me up," David replied, his voice steady. "She needs to face what she's done." Inside the courtroom, Victoria sat at the defendant's table surrounded by 3 expensive lawyers. She looked composed, almost serene, as if the charges against her were simply an administrative error that would soon be corrected. Marcus sat in the gallery, his face drawn with guilt and exhaustion. The past months had been hard on him as he'd slowly come to terms with how completely he'd been manipulated. Sarah Mitchell sat behind them, her notebook ready. Her investigative reporting had helped expose the criminal network. Victoria was part of a sophisticated operation that had targeted dozens of families across 3 states, stealing millions of dollars and causing at least 12 deaths at facilities like Sunset Manor. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented David's recorded testimony from his months of secret evidence gathering, medical records showing the systematic poisoning he'd endured, and financial documents proving the elaborate fraud Victoria had orchestrated. Grace Chen testified about the conditions at Sunset Manor, her voice shaking as she described the other patients who hadn't been as fortunate as David. But it was David's own testimony that proved most powerful. He took the stand on the trial's 3rd day, his voice clear and strong as he recounted his ordeal. "She convinced my son that I was losing my mind," David said, looking directly at Victoria. "She showed him forged medical reports, staged incidents to make me appear confused and violent. She made him believe that committing me was an act of love." Victoria's lead attorney tried to portray David as a confused, elderly man whose memory couldn't be trusted, but the recordings spoke for themselves. Hour after hour of Victoria's voice, coaching Marcus on how to interpret his father's behavior, planning the timeline for taking control of the family's assets, discussing the gradual increase of sedatives that would eventually prove fatal. The most damning evidence came from Marcus himself. He took the stand on the 4th day, his testimony halting and painful as he described the systematic way Victoria had manipulated his perceptions. "She made me believe my mother was having a breakdown," Marcus said, unable to look at Octavia. "She convinced me that taking Dad to the nursing home was protecting him from Mom's erratic behavior. When she suggested leaving Mom on that road, she said it was the kindest way to help her accept reality about her new situation." "Did Ms. Pierce ever suggest that your father should die?" the prosecutor asked gently. Marcus's voice broke. "She said it would be a mercy, that he was suffering unnecessarily, that prolonging his life was cruel. She made it sound like love." Victoria's composure finally cracked during her own testimony. Under cross-examination, she grew increasingly agitated, her careful mask slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "These people had everything handed to them," she said, her voice rising. "A beautiful home, money, family, love they took for granted. I worked for what I took. I earned it by being smarter, by seeing opportunities they were too naive to protect against." "So you believe you had the right to steal from the Ravens family?" the prosecutor pressed. "I believe in survival of the fittest. David Ravens was dying anyway. I just made the process more efficient while ensuring his assets went to someone who could appreciate them." The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was firm and clear. "Guilty on all charges." Victoria was sentenced to 20 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman who'd seen her share of elder abuse cases, made her feelings clear during sentencing. "Ms. Pierce, you didn't just steal money from the Ravens family," the judge said. "You stole time, trust, and the fundamental bonds that hold families together. You turned love into a weapon and used it to cause immeasurable harm. The sentence of this court reflects not just your crimes against this family, but the dozens of other victims your network has destroyed." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she turned back to look at Octavia and David one final time. Her words carried clearly across the silent courtroom. "You think this is over? You'll never feel safe again. I've destroyed something in your family that can never be repaired." David stood slowly, his arm around Octavia's waist. "You're wrong," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You've taught us that love is stronger than manipulation, that families can survive anything if they choose to fight for each other. Thank you for the lesson." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded them. Sarah Mitchell stood slightly apart, already working on her follow-up story about the conviction and its broader implications for elder abuse prevention. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter asked. "Grateful," Octavia replied. "Not just for justice, but for the opportunity to rebuild our family on a foundation of truth instead of manipulation." "What's next for you and your husband?" David smiled, the first genuine smile Octavia had seen from him since his rescue. "We're going home to Moonrise Cottage. We have work to do." The drive back to the cottage was quiet, each of them processing the finality of Victoria's conviction. Marcus followed in his own car, having asked if he could stay for dinner. The relationship between him and his parents was still fragile, still under construction, but it was based now on honesty rather than assumption. Amy Watson met them at the cottage door, her nurse's uniform replaced by casual clothes that marked the end of her shift caring for David during his recovery. "How did it go?" "It's over," Octavia said simply. "She's going to prison for a very long time." That evening, they gathered around the cottage's dining table Octavia, David, Marcus, Amy, Grace, and Elena, who'd driven up from Sacramento to hear the verdict. The conversation was quieter than usual, marked by the strange anticlimax that often follows the end of a long ordeal. "I keep thinking about what Victoria said," Marcus admitted as they cleared the dishes, "about destroying something that can never be repaired. Is she right? Are we fooling ourselves thinking we can go back to being a normal family?" David set down his coffee cup, considering the question carefully. "We can't go back to what we were," he said finally. "That family, the one that existed before Victoria, was vulnerable because we didn't communicate directly about problems, because we trusted too easily, because we assumed love was enough to protect us from harm. But what we're building now is stronger," Octavia added. "It's based on choice rather than obligation, on truth rather than comfortable assumptions. Victoria did destroy the old version of our family, but she also forced us to create something better." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen this in other families who've survived abuse. The relationships that emerge from the healing process are often more authentic and resilient than what existed before. Trauma can destroy, but it can also teach and strengthen." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I want to keep doing the work," he said finally. "The therapy, the learning about manipulation, the effort to become someone who protects families instead of enabling their destruction. Not because I owe you, but because I want to be the kind of person who deserves your trust." "You already are," David said gently. "You chose truth over comfort when it mattered most. You helped us save my life. That's the person you really are when no one's trying to manipulate you into being someone else." As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Octavia found herself alone with David on the cottage's front porch, watching the fog roll in from the ocean. It had become their ritual, this quiet time together, processing the day and planning for tomorrow. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "The future," Octavia replied. "For the first time in months, we actually have one again. Victoria thought she was destroying us, but instead, she gave us a chance to build something meaningful from the wreckage." "What do you want that to look like?" Octavia smiled, breathing in the salt air and the scent of Grace's roses. "I want to help other families avoid what we went through. I want Moonrise Cottage to be a place where people can heal from betrayal and learn to trust again. I want our story to mean something." David reached for her hand, his fingers warm and real and alive. "Then that's what we'll do, together." 2 years after Victoria's conviction, Moonrise Cottage had become something neither Octavia nor David had originally envisioned. What started as a simple refuge had evolved into a comprehensive recovery center for families torn apart by elder abuse and manipulation. The cottage itself had been expanded to include a second building with counseling rooms and a library, while the original structure retained its homey atmosphere with individual guest rooms and the large communal kitchen where healing often happened over shared meals. Amy Watson had completed her nurse practitioner degree and now ran the medical side of their program, specializing in helping people recover from pharmaceutical abuse and the physical effects of prolonged manipulation. Grace Chen had left her position at the county health department to become their full-time horticulture therapist, using her expertise to help residents literally plant new roots while they healed emotionally. Elena Vasquez visited monthly from Sacramento, where she'd been promoted to head the state's new elder abuse prevention unit. Her work was directly influenced by what she'd learned at Moonrise, and she often brought delegations of social workers and law enforcement officials to study their methods. Sarah Mitchell's book about their case had been published to critical acclaim and was now required reading in social work programs across the country. More importantly, it had helped countless families recognize warning signs before manipulation could take hold. But the most meaningful measure of their success wasn't in the accolades or the visitors. It was in the letters that arrived weekly from former residents who'd rebuilt their lives, from families who'd learned to communicate honestly, from people who'd discovered that healing was possible even after the deepest betrayals. "Listen to this one," David said, reading from the morning mail as they sat in what was now officially called the Family Reunification Center. This is from Robert Martinez in Oregon. "Dear friends, it's been 18 months since I left Moonrise after my daughter tried to have me declared incompetent so she could control my finances. I wanted you to know that we had Christmas dinner together last week, the first time in 3 years. She's been in therapy too, working to understand how her husband manipulated her into seeing me as a burden instead of her father. We're taking it slow, but we're building something new. Thank you for showing us that families can survive anything if they're willing to do the work." Octavia filed the letter with hundreds of others like it, each representing a family that had found its way back from manipulation and abuse. The work was hard and often heartbreaking. Not every family could be saved. Not every relationship could be repaired, but the successes made it worthwhile. Marcus had found his calling working with other adult children who'd been manipulated into abandoning or abusing their parents. He lived in town now, close enough to have dinner with his parents twice a week, but independent enough to maintain his own identity separate from their shared trauma. "I meet with a support group every Tuesday night," he explained to a new resident, a woman whose son had been convinced by his wife to cut all contact with his mother. "We're all people who were used as weapons against our own families. The manipulation is so sophisticated that you don't realize what's happening until it's almost too late. But recovery is possible for everyone involved, if there's genuine commitment to change." The cottage's dining room that evening hosted 8 people, Octavia and David, Amy and Grace, 2 new residents working through family estrangement, and Dr. Rebecca Torres, the family therapist who'd helped them navigate their own healing process and now consulted regularly with their program. "I've been thinking about what makes some families more vulnerable to manipulation than others," Dr. Torres said as they shared Amy's famous lasagna. "It's not about intelligence or education. It's about communication patterns and the ability to discuss uncomfortable truths directly. Victoria succeeded with us because we avoided conflict," David observed. "I suspected something was wrong, but didn't want to upset Octavia by sharing my concerns. Octavia trusted Marcus to handle the hospice arrangements because she didn't want to burden him with her questions. Marcus believed Victoria's lies because he didn't want to acknowledge that his father was dying. And predators like Victoria are experts at exploiting those communication gaps," Grace added. "They insert themselves into the silence between family members and fill it with their own version of reality." One of the new residents, a man in his 70s whose daughter had isolated him from his grandchildren, looked up from his dinner. "How do you learn to trust again? How do you know if someone's genuinely trying to help or just manipulating you more skillfully?" "You start with small things," Amy replied. "You test people's reactions when you set boundaries, when you disagree with them, when you need something they might not want to give. Manipulators reveal themselves pretty quickly when they can't control your responses. And you remember that healthy relationships can tolerate questions," Octavia added. "Victoria always had explanations for everything, always made us feel guilty for doubting her. People who genuinely care about you want you to ask questions, want you to feel secure in your understanding of what's happening." After dinner, as had become tradition, Octavia and David walked through Grace's expanded garden before settling on the front porch to watch the sunset. The roses were in full bloom, their scent mixing with the salt air to create something that always made Octavia think of hope and new beginnings. "Do you ever wonder what Victoria is doing in prison?" David asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "Sometimes," Octavia admitted. "Octavia, I hope she's getting help, learning to build something instead of just stealing from others. But mostly I try not to think about her at all. She's had enough of our energy." "Do you think she knows what she created here? That her attempt to destroy us led to something that's helping hundreds of other families?" Octavia smiled, watching the last light fade over the ocean. "I hope so. I hope she understands that love really is stronger than manipulation, that building is more powerful than destroying. But whether she learns that lesson or not, we're living proof of it." A light went on in one of the guest room windows, probably the newest arrival. A woman whose adult children had been convinced by her new husband to have her declared mentally incompetent so they could control her estate. Tomorrow there would be legal consultations and family therapy sessions, and the patient work of untangling truth from manipulation. But tonight, it was enough to sit in the garden they'd grown together, surrounded by evidence of lives rebuilt and families restored, knowing that they'd transformed Victoria's cruelty into something beautiful and healing. "What's our next project?" David asked, taking her hand. "I want to start a training program," Octavia said, "something that teaches families how to recognize manipulation before it takes hold, how to communicate more effectively, how to support each other without enabling abuse. Prevention instead of just treatment." "Exactly. Victoria succeeded because we were vulnerable. We can teach other families how to protect themselves." Above them, the first stars appeared through the coastal fog, points of light in the gathering darkness. Inside the cottage, people who'd been discarded and betrayed by their own families prepared for sleep, knowing they were safe, knowing they were valued, knowing that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Marcus's car pulled into the driveway, returning from his evening support group meeting. He'd asked if he could spend the night in his old room, said he had something important to discuss with them in the morning. Octavia suspected it involved a job offer he'd received from a national elder advocacy organization, an opportunity to spread their work to a broader audience. "Whatever he decides," David said, correctly interpreting her thoughtful expression. "We'll support him. That's what families do. they give each other room to grow while staying connected to their roots. As they stood to go inside, Octavia paused for one last look at the cottage that had become their life's work. The building glowed with warm light from windows where people were reading, talking quietly, or simply enjoying the peace of a place where they didn't have to pretend to be anything other than who they really were. Victoria Pierce had tried to teach them that trust was dangerous, that love was weakness, that families were just opportunities for exploitation. Instead, she'd taught them something entirely different, that some bonds are stronger than manipulation, that some love is more powerful than fear, and that sometimes the greatest cruelty inadvertently creates the greatest compassion. Moonrise Cottage stood as proof of that truth, a lighthouse in the fog for anyone still lost in the darkness of family betrayal. And Octavia Sterling, who'd once been abandoned on a lonely road with nothing but David's oversized slippers and a handful of hope, now stood surrounded by the family she'd chosen and built, knowing that love, real love, built on truth and respect and choice, could survive anything. The cottage door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing in warmth and conversation and the promise of tomorrow. Outside, the ocean whispered its ancient songs of storms weathered and peace restored, while inside, the work of healing continued, one conversation, one meal, one carefully rebuilt relationship at a time. Thank you so much for joining Octavia and David on their incredible journey from betrayal to healing, from abandonment to building a chosen family at Moonrise Cottage. This story of resilience, love, and the power of truth over manipulation reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have the strength to rebuild and create something beautiful from the ashes. If this story touched your heart or made you think about the importance of family, trust, and standing up against abuse, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback means the world to me and helps me craft better stories for you. Did you enjoy Shadow's End? Please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach others who might need to hear Octavia's story of hope and healing. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest storytelling adventures. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that they're stronger than they know, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the greatest betrayals can lead to the most meaningful transformations. Until our next story, remember, like Octavia learned, you are never truly alone when you choose to fight for what's right. Take care, and I'll see you in the next tale. Keep listening, keep dreaming, and keep believing in the power of stories to change lives.